Jack Stephen and David Bowie's teeth. And just to warn you, this podcast does contain adult themes and references.
And just that little statement sort of set me off again, because it was like, well, you know what? If David Bowie likes this, fuck the rest. I know what I did with the Eurythmics. I know what I did with Sade. I know, I have no issues with that. Now, the fact that people claimed it, well, that's down to you. That's bullshit. I was known as the Keith Richards of A&R.
Jack Stephen is an A&R music industry legend, and we're here to get a personal insight into the man himself and his life and times in the cutthroat and often bizarre world of the music industry. Having worked with artists and bands such as the likes of Eurythmics, Sade, Bow Wow Wow, Joe Boxers, Blow Monkeys, Ministry of Sound, and the list goes on. He said at one point, new artists were so keen to work with him, he'd have to leave the office by the back door to avoid being accosted by musicians touting demos. In music, he was known as the man to know. From working on the 1972 Rolling Stones album, Exile on Main Street, to creating the most successful dance compilation series in the world. He has a fair few tales to tell in a rock and roll ride through an industry rife with rumours and half-truths. A life led by music, chance, determination, and an intuitive ear for what sounds right. This is Jack Stephen and David Bowie's teeth. I'm Douglas Pye, and welcome, Jack Stephen.
Hello. Sorry, I was just drinking coffee. Sorry.
Let's clear up the obvious question some people may be asking. And that's before we even get onto the subject of teeth. Can you explain what A&R means and what it involves?
Yeah, A&R stands for Artist and Repertoire, and it's basically the executive position in a record company which is on the front line of finding new artists, signing them, developing their songwriting, developing their recordings, getting producers, imagery and stuff like that. It dates back to the 40s and 50s. And back in the 60s, most A&R people were actually producers. So, when you hear the records on Stax, for example, the production teams were within the actual labels, as they were with Motown. For me, when I got into it in the 70s, basically what it meant was, I was sort of in my early 20s. It basically meant I got a company car, expenses paid, and basically I could get into every club in the world. Great job, eh?
Fantastic. And the next question before getting on to our story is, of course, David Bowie's teeth. So, Jack, what's with the teeth?
Well, David Bowie had died, and generally I don't do interviews, and I sort of, but Sky News rang me up, and they, wanted me to talk to him about him on their 1 o'clock news. And he was very special to me, so I thought, I'll do that. And so I did the live interview, and I thought generally it went very well. And then my phone was starting to integrate. My phone would stop ringing, and I was a bit emotional, so I didn't really want to answer my phone. And then my daughter rang up. She goes, the first thing she says, she goes, "Dad, you've gone viral." And I went, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, everyone thinks you're David Bowie." And I said, "How come?" And I said, "Well, they can't believe that Jack Stephen's a real name. It must have been made up in a minute." And so then the whole thing kind of exploded. It exploded on the internet. And it got a little bit sort of weird because, the funniest thing was that they, somebody got a picture of Bowie's teeth, and then they managed to get a picture of my teeth, and then they superimposed the two teeth together, and they were identical. Hence, I have David Bowie's teeth. I would say that both of us had dental work, so it might have been the same dentist. I tell you, I do get these things. I did have a funny thing. I was on the train on Saturday, heading to see an old friend. And to my horror, a whole load of Newcastle football supporters had just come out of Brentford and got into my carriage. And you got to love them. They're lost, and they were singing away. And then one of them just went, "Oh, look, it's David Bowie." And then I had renditions of Let's Dance, Ziggy Stardust and Gene Genie from a group of Newcastle supporters. They made that journey quite enjoyable for a change.
And as you can tell, it's not just the teeth, but Jack does actually look like David Bowie. And to add, we're also in Dean Street Studios, where Bowie has recorded with Tony Visconti. But hey, that's enough about David Bowie. For the time being, let's get back to you, Jack. Now, if we're going to do a story about Jack and his life in A&R, you'd have thought we'd start when he got his first job, but no, Jack's formative years are far too interesting to miss out on. So let's start with your early life.
My family, my mother, it was from, well, they're basically refugees, Polish refugees and Russian refugees. Well, most of my family were interned either in Russian concentration camps or in German concentration camps. And so that's kind of my background. And they managed to escape from Siberia, get to Tehran, and then from Tehran they came over as refugees, and we ended up living in a little bedsit in Chepstow Villas. So there's a sort of the whole family. There was me, my mum, my dad at the time, my uncle, my gran, and a cat. And then my dad sort of left when I was about 2 years old. He was a gambler. But what I do remember, I mean, I remember sort of, regular get-togethers with a lot of, in particularly my nan's relatives and friends. And they would always come over and show off their tattoos, their number tattoos, and talk about what happened at the concentration camps. And they'd always raise a glass of vodka to lost families. And there was always this kind of, it was an odd feeling. There was a great feeling of relief, but guilt. And the general toast was that the only good Nazi or Soviet was a dead one.
Okay, so not your average start in life. Did your mum start becoming the breadwinner then, I presume?
Yeah, I mean, my nan, she used to get her what they call national assistance. My mum went out and she started working actually in a coffee shop called De Kies, which is a Polish coffee shop, which is sort of still in existence in South Kent. She was very creative and a singer and a dancer. So she started getting jobs dancing in shows and stuff. So my earliest memories is sort of being backstage at the Albert Hall, showgirls, and that's what my background is. Then, if I remember correctly, she managed to get herself a job as a tutor at St. Martin's School of Art. So she started teaching that. And then off the back of that, she started doing recording sessions. And then I remember one session in particular, which I was tiny, but I went to Abbey Road and watched her record a track with a 20-piece orchestra live. But that's how I kind of got brought up. I mean, my mum was extremely beautiful, and she got known as the Russian princess in the sort of London scene. And she used to hang out with, musicians like Paul McCartney, Brian Jones, Clive Westlake, who was a songwriter. He used to write songs for her and stuff like that. And, of course, attracted a lot of suitors, as they say. I mean, I do have a memory of sitting in the back of a lot of sports cars in a very uncomfortable back seat, if there was a seat at all. And then I remember getting a bit of a relief because she sort of started going out with a guy called John who had a Bentley. And I thought, this is all right. I'm sitting in the back of a Bentley. That's all right. But then that turned sour because he turned out to be, how should I put it? I spilt some water in the back of his car and he punched me in my gut for doing that. And then he sort of started becoming abusive. And I guess that was sort of one of the starts of me being slightly rebellious because I got a bit irritated with that because he used to, he'd hit me in places that my mum could never see. But he was an architect and he used to have all of his architectural stuff at the house. And I used to sabotage his work because I was quite good at geometry. And so I used to sort of extend walls and, decrease foundations. And he got into a bit of trouble. He never knew I did that, actually.
So it's here we'll introduce a certain Stuart Stephen, who was a journalist who'd come to your house to interview your mum about her singing career. Tell me about Stuart Stephen.
Well, the first time I met him, I came home and my mum was sitting next to this very slightly Al Pacino-looking guy in a sharp Italian suit. I mean, beautiful suit, beautifully dressed. And, this guy, John, sitting in there. And I sort of came up the alleyway of the house. And by this time, anything that I could do on John, I would do. And I saw a hose next to my feet. So I switched the hose on and sneaked up through the flowers, to drench John. But I mean, he was smart enough to hear me and, dive out of the way. And the person that I hit was the guy in the Italian suit, and I thought, oh, God, here we go. I'm going to get beaten up for this or something or another. And I think, this guy sort of saw that I was a little bit tentative, and he came up to me and he said, look, don't worry. And he pulled out his wallet and he pulled out a 10-shilling note and he said, why don't you do something useful with that hose and wash my car? And that was sort of the first time that I kind of met a guy that was, I guess, positive, put a different slant on it. And that's the first time I met Stuart.
We're going to cut now to 1965 when your mother married,
Yeah.
said Stuart Stephen, who, interestingly, was also a refugee, having escaped Nazi Germany with his family as a boy.
Yeah.
I mean, at this time, you were 8, and as I think you might have said, you only ever spoke Polish?
Yeah, I mean, the environment that I lived in, nobody spoke English. I mean, my mum's English was very broken. I mean, she could get by, but nobody spoke English. So, our first language was Polish and our second language is Russian. So I could understand that, but I didn't speak a word of English, which of course made it very difficult at school. And Stuart, bless him, I mean, he sort of saw that I wouldn't be able to survive without, the English language. He took it on himself to slowly teach me, which is, and here we are.
He sounds like a really interesting guy, so quite a lovely character.
He was a wonderful guy. He was a great character. I mean, I never really at the time understood, what he did and the importance of the people around him. I never really understood that. He was determined to take on the responsibility of looking after me and to, help me through problems, language problems, trust problems. I mean, there was a lot of things. And he was, he was a brilliant character. I mean, he not only taught me how to speak English, he tried to teach me how to write. I remember one time he sort of, announces to me, let's go fly a kite on Hampstead Heath, and just came completely out of the blue. And he sort of bought this kite at Hamley's. And I went, all right. It was all a new experience for me, somebody taking me out to do something, other than, sort of hitting me, really. And so off we went to Hampstead Heath, and there's all these people, with their kites up in the air. Unfortunately, whatever we tried to do, we couldn't get the kite up. I mean, it was just, we spent an hour and a half, which is frustrating because everyone else had their kites up there. All ours ever did was go up a little bit and crash down to the ground, and then we had to fix it, and we did that over and over again. So I was a little bit sort of despondent, and we got in the car. And he goes, don't worry, Kuba, which is what my nickname was in those days. And he said, we'll get a bigger kite. So I went, all right. So the following week, he came in with a bigger kite and, went to Hampstead Heath. And the same thing happened. We couldn't get the thing up. So back in the car. And he goes, look, don't worry. We'll get an even bigger kite. So I said, okay. And so the following week, he went, and the same thing happened. Just couldn't get the kite. It was really frustrating. So I was a little bit despondent about it. And he said, look, we'll discuss this when I get back from America. He's going on some story in America. And anyhow, he came back with this massive box from the States. And he said, right, we're going to get this kite up. And I sort of rather despondently said, what difference? We just can't do it. And he said, Kuba, this one's got a fucking engine. And sure enough, we went there, got the engine going, and up it went.
Mary Poppins, eat your heart out. You just mentioned you were called Kuba.
Yeah.
What is
Kuba,
that?
Kuba is a abbreviation of Jacek, which is Jack. And when he adopted me, actually, it was a bit of a relief because I had a completely unpronounceable name to anything but a hardened Pole. He adopted me. And so we went Jack Stuart Stephen. I mean, that's, So it's not a name just made up in a minute.
Yeah. At the time your mum met your stepdad, he was a reporter. But he quickly ascended the journalistic ladder, becoming associate editor of the Daily Mail, later editor of the Mail on Sunday, and then editor of the Evening Standard. I mean, I've read a few articles about him and all remark on his sense of humour and mischievousness. He was also seen as an outsider and very much a crusader, campaigning on issues he felt strongly about. This is not something I associate with papers like the Daily Mail.
He was full of contradictions. He really had a sense of right and wrong. I mean, that was something that was very strong in him. In terms of the way he viewed things, it didn't matter where it came from as long as there was it was correct, or it was right, or it was the right thing to do. He hated, corruption and stuff like that. But no, he was a staunch Labour, supporter, which was strange being at Associated Newspapers. I mean, you don't see that. But he was very fair-minded, and he really did support politicians that, he felt had a genuine desire to change society for the better. And then through him, I met people like Tony Blair, Michael Foot. I mean, he was actually instrumental in convincing Tony Blair to become, leader of the Labour Party. I mean, one person that I really liked was David Owen, who was an incredibly... I mean, why he never became Prime Minister, I don't know. He was one of the smartest people that I've ever met. I mean, he was so smart that to a young lad, he was able to explain so that I could understand the intricacies of the Balkan Wars. Now, that is so complicated. And he used to always make me laugh because he used to call Tony Blair El Presidente. But then there were, lots of other people. I mean, on the creative front, Alec Guinness, John le Carré were people that we knew quite well. I mean, one great little story is that there was a small elderly lady. I came home once and she's sitting in an armchair, and she turned out to be Mary Rombert. Anyhow, she took a liking to me, and she sort of went, she said, put your hand out. I mean, she must have been in her 70s. So I put my arm out. And she pirouetted under my arm. And she went, now you can tell everybody that you're the last person to dance with Dame Mary Rombert, which was, I thought, a great thing.
Now, this sounds like a fascinating and quite a charmed life. And you're also one of the lucky few to have the chance of a private education.
Well... yeah, you say that, but actually school was a real problem for me because, firstly, I didn't speak the language well enough, certainly from my early days. I mean, and, my dad used to teach me sort of every evening, so, my language was a problem. And I ended up actually getting thrown out of most schools. Just simply, I didn't understand what was going on. And then in later life, actually, I found out that I had dyslexia, which I never realised, which makes, a lot of sense now.
Yeah, and I believe that wasn't till, in your late 50s?
Yeah, late 50s, yeah. I had to, I had a studio in Texas, and the Dyslexia Society, the guy that was going to do their ads for them didn't turn up. So they asked me, because I had an English accent, if I would, sort of do the voiceover on the ads. So I said, sure. And then when they watched me with the notes and everything, they sort of, after that, I did the thing, and they went, the first thing they asked actually was, they said, were you good at geometry? So I said, yeah, I was great at geometry. And then they sort of said, you are dyslexic. We can tell you now that you are dyslexic. And I had no idea. So I lived my whole life with this sort of syndrome.
And so you found out you were dyslexic by doing an advert for the Dyslexia Society. That's so one. So obviously, with what you know now as dyslexia and also obviously lack of English, school must have been, as we've touched on before, really difficult.
I mean, school for me was horrendous. I mean, there was one school that I went to that actually got me through it, which was a private crammer. But most of the schools, I mean, particularly St. Benedict's that I went to, were sort of, we had the tail end of the Dickensian rule. I mean, it was... my problem was, firstly, I struggled with understanding what people were saying. Then when it was written, I mean, it just made no sense to me whatsoever. When I wrote, I didn't write, words because of what the meaning of the word did. I followed the pattern of the artwork of the J and the, O and the, B. So it wasn't that I was understanding what it said. I was just making... oddly, I found a old biology book of mine, and I just laughed. I mean, I looked at it, and it looked amazing. I mean, the pictorial parts of it were great, and I was very good at sort of, painting and drawing and stuff like that. But the actual writing, it was an artwork. It wasn't actually literature. I mean, I drew it like artwork, So that was very difficult for me. And then, added to that, um, the kind of the rules and regulations and the kind of Dickensian approach of this is the way it is. I mean, I kept getting into trouble. Obviously I got brought up with a hatred of, the Soviet and the Nazis, and they were, totalitarian oligarchs, that were based on rules and regulations. And if you stepped away from those rules and regulations, so, being brought up with that, rules weren't really for me. And at home, we always had this kind of environment of being able to ask questions and explore things and stuff. But at school, I was never allowed to do this. If I turned around and went, why, just to get an explanation, I was told to shut up. And if I did it again, I would be sent out and get beaten. I mean, I had a funny thing with St. Benedict's in particular. It was I was with some. There was a group of us. We still keep in touch from back in those days. And oddly, we're all from, overseas background. Because ensconced in that school was also this kind of Johnny Foreigner view. We were foreign and we should go back to our countries. And of course, if my family went back to Poland, they'd get shot by the communists. So, we sort of put up with this. But two of them turned around and said, oh, it wasn't, there was a lot of stories about a priest that was inappropriate with young boys. And they went, well, it wasn't too bad. And I went, you got to be joking. I mean, we faced perpetual abuse. And they went, well, you only feel like that because you got beaten 5 days a week. And I went, well, yes. But I said, but also, when we were in classes, I mean, how many times was a board rubber thrown at our head? That's abuse. How many times was a chalk thrown at our heads? That's abuse. And then they, went, well, yeah, you're right. So it wasn't a great time. And I did feel at times that I was in, in Dachau. That's just my imagination, but it felt like I was in Dachau. I mean, being thrown out was actually probably the best thing for me because, particularly with St. Benedict's, I carry that scar as a badge of honor. And I managed to escape with my soul intact. I mean, maybe I had a few scars, but my soul's intact. One of my regrets in life was, again, at St. Benedict's, I had piano lessons. I mean, I was very lucky because I was sort of born in West London, and West London was this hubbub of music and stuff like that. So I kind of got it in my mind that I might try and do that. And I guess through my dyslexia, there were certain indicators to me that I could understand music better than literature. I mean, I got a real empathy with that. It's sort of really I just could understand it. And so, I went for music lessons, and I always remember this, my great regret in life. And I wanted to sort of play, like Oscar Peterson, and the school wanted me, to play classically. And so I used to, every time my hands would go flat on the piano, I still got the scars on my knuckles. The teacher would just slam a ruler, the edge of the ruler onto my knuckles to basically play, upright classically. And it's like, well, what's good for Oscar Peterson is good enough for me, really. And they wouldn't have that. And that really there came a point when I tried it again and I still used to look over my shoulder, and I just couldn't do it. But that's a great regret in life, particularly because at the time, being in West London, there was this whole scene coming up. And one of the reasons I love the Rolling Stones so much is that they picked up on a music that sort of reflected an oppression, but was just so cool, and I could just so relate to all of that. And it was a music that really deserved recognition. And, they represented this kind of, this post-war English youth culture. This is screw the rules. Let's try to break frontiers. Let's do, I could understand what they were doing. I could understand their music. Off the back of that, I could research, Mississippi blues or, sort of New York jazz or Chicago blues. So I really warmed and had an empathy with that. And so it was always, I think that is the one thing that I really regret is that I wasn't able to transpose, the feeling and an understanding that I have of music like the Stones to being able to play it. That I really regret. And I think that is the one thing that I'm most bitter about. But it always made me laugh with the Stones because they were the most, they represented the type of young male that no parent would And you were in two camps. You were either a Rolling Stones fan or you were a Beatles fan, right? And most people were Beatles fan, and I was like, there was only two of us that were like Rolling Stones fans. And so we say, and they're going, yeah, but parents don't like them. They're wrong. They got long hair and blah blah blah. And I kept sort of saying, well, this is a cultural thing. I mean, I grew my hair long. I wore cowboy boots. I adjusted my grey school suit into kind of a almost a kind of rock and roll spiv look. I mean, it was so I did all of that, and they're huge influence. They push back the boundaries, and of course I laugh now because here we are. I mean, there's sort of 60. Well, it's almost 60 years, isn't it? I mean, 60 years later, they're still touring. They're still doing their same thing. They're still breaking boundaries. They recorded an album that went into the charts. I mean, if you listen to Heaven, I mean, Heaven is probably one of the best songs that they've written since, Gimme Shelter. I mean, and they were an example of what was happening in West London. So there were like all of these clubs, there were all these filmmakers, there were all these designers, I mean, you had the Chelsea drugstore, you had the Café des Artistes. I mean, the big one was the Pheasantry. And everybody, I mean, almost every weekend, you had the cream of modern thinking, be it films, photography, music. I mean, that was the great hangout. So I was lucky. I was able to get in, even though I was young.
I heard about the Pheasantry, that there was a rabbit there, that someone dyed it green or blue or something. Anyway.
It started off as the Jefferson Starship White Rabbit. That was kind of describes the Pheasantry. That's kind of cryptic. I wonder if people understand that.
Without the knowledge of you having dyslexia at the time, what was your family thinking was going on with all that, if you're being chucked out of all these schools?
I mean, my mum despaired, but loved me however stupid people told her I was. I mean, she was wonderful. Stuart was, he always had a kind of little wry smile on his face. I think when I decided to rebel, I think that there was a sort of secret admiration that he had. I don't think either of them really understood the level of abuse that went on. But I think, I became known as his troublesome son, to Fleet Street. But he was always brilliant. I mean, he would always stand up, and we'll talk about it later. But I mean, he was, when I do something crazy, he was 9 times out of 10 supportive of it.
And so, with school done, or should I say, when you were done with school, what led you to the music industry?
Well, my mum was a singer and a dancer really before she was an artist, and so my dad loved music. I mean, there's a lot of music in the house. Some of it which has been created with my mum, and also there were certain radio stations I used to listen to that I used to love. I mean, I remember I think it started with Radio Caroline and then Luxembourg after that. I used to love listening to music because I could understand it. There was a communication from music that really resonated with me. And it sort of got very deep into my soul. And I guess that when you're dyslexic with literature, that doesn't transpose to music. So, I mean, even in my A&R days, I mean, even now, I was at studio a few weeks ago, and people are really amazed about how I can pinpoint certain sounds and stuff like that, even at my age. But that's something I've always found kind of natural, and that was what really drew me. Was I felt a warmth and an intimacy with music that I didn't feel anywhere else. And then the way I got into the music industry was pure chance. I was as I told you, I was a big Rolling Stones fan. So I used to go to lots of gigs and stuff like that. And then I discovered that they were going to rehearse in Montauk, Long Island. And so in America. And I thought, you know what, it's a little island. I might be able to find out. So anyhow, I ended up going over to Long Island and looking for them. Now, luckily, I had an aunt there in Port Jefferson, and my uncle had a garage in Southampton. So you go Long Island, you've got Port Jefferson, you got Southampton, the Hamptons. And then Montauk was a short hop from Southampton. And, and I went into Montauk. And in those days, it was a little village. So it was quite easy to find out. You could hear them. As soon as you came into the village, you could basically hear them. So I went to the building where I could hear the music, and I sat outside. And this guy came out at the door and was basically going to shoo me away. And it told me to bugger off, so I told him to, fuck off. And then he noticed I had an English accent, so he started talking to me. And then I noticed he had a English accent. And he turned out to be the Stones PR guy, a guy called Les Perrin.
So there's a few questions there.
Right, go on.
You just so happened to be in New York. You were staying with your aunt.
I had a multiple entry visa because I had an aunt in America. My Stuart's sister lived in America. So it was easy for me to go in and out the country. And so I got some jobs, saved the money, paid for the flight, went over there, got in touch with her. She said it's fine for me to stay there. Fernando was, the sort of garage mechanic, gave me a job as a petrol pump attendant. And I sort of slowly but surely, which to be honest with you, I mean, it sounds a bit grand now, but, in those days, a lot of kids used to follow bands that way. I mean, it wasn't, America was a bit of a long distance, but through Europe, I mean, kids would go, Led Zeppelin are playing, Paris. Well, kids would go over to Paris and hang out and try and get tickets. I mean, this was kind of not unusual. I guess it is now because it's quite dangerous, but in those days it wasn't. But America was a bit of a hole. Les Perrin knew my dad, so he rang him up and told him that I was there. And Stuart did freak out a bit because I didn't tell him I was going there. And, it was the days of long distance calls and stuff like that. So I never, so he was a bit peeved with me.
And then you got a job with?
Well, Les Perrin was brilliant. And I mean, he was brilliant with me because he, my dad obviously said, for God's sake, look after him. And then we started chatting. And I always remember, because so we talk about, music history and the Stones and stuff like that. And he went, he said, you know a lot about the Rolling Stones music for such a young man, he goes. And I went, you kind of know a lot about their music for an old geezer. I went, and he burst out laughing. And then from that, he sort of tested me out on a few things. And he found out that I was, when I was 14, I was a messenger on the Daily Express. So he used to sort of use me for running. And then he got me the job as tape op when the Stones recorded Exile on Main Street in the south of France. So I was what they call the gopher, basically, the young kid there. And I used to press the play button and stuff like that.
Firstly, Les Perrin wasn't just the Rolling Stones PR, which is big in itself. He was every band who was anyone's PR. So, you happened to come across this guy who was really big in the music industry.
He was very different. I learnt later. I mean, I came across him, or rather, he came across me. I mean, but a lot of things in life, are happy accidents. If you make the effort to, sort of put yourself out. I was, it was a happy accident that I was born to my mother, and I was able to go to Abbey Road and see these things. It was a happy accident that, I got adopted by a journalist. It was a happy accident that, I met all of these sort of people. So, but if I wasn't on that lawn, if I hadn't made the effort, my career could be very, very different. But he was brilliant because I used to sit and talk with him. And I mean, he looked after Frank Sinatra. He looked after Billie Holiday. He used to tell me how he used to hide Billie Holiday's gear at the Palladium whenever she did the Palladium because he knew that she'd be useless if she got the gear before the show. So he used to tell me he used to hide it under the bath, right? Sort of stuff like that. He told me about how this was fascinating stuff to a young kid. I mean, he told me the call he got from Redlands when the police raided Keith Richards' house. And he used to tell me sort of stories about John Lennon, and it was brilliant.
What was the story about John Lennon?
Oh, he made me laugh. John Lennon went. He always said this, and I learned a lot about PR from him, And apparently John Lennon was getting really fed up with the press, and so he came into Les's office and started moaning about, what we're going to do about this press, And Les just turned around. He always quoted this. He said, "You know what I told him? I said, you should worry if they're not writing about you." And that was the end of that conversation. But in that one sentence, that is absolutely brilliant. And when you see people's careers through media, you recognize that sometimes it doesn't matter what kind of, coverage it is, whether it's good or bad, it does create a name. And often people forget the bad, so it was interesting, so I learned a lot from him.
Basically, at the age of 16 or 17, you started working on Rolling Stones album. You're not just working for the Rolling Stones, which quite a big band, but also on Exile on Main Street, which is up there as one of the greatest albums of all time. And just to sum up, that the Stones recorded this in the south of France at Villa Nelcott, which is a chateau rented out by Keith Richards. They had a mobile recording studio because they were all in tax exile at the same time. So amazing situation, amazing album. And obviously you're going in as a tape-op, and you must have been, as a tape-op, you must have been like a fly on the wall. Was it all as mad and improvised as it's made out to be?
It was crazy. I mean, I was probably less of a fly on the wall and more of a sponge. I mean, I just sort of took it all in. It was all based on jams, So, basically, the band's equipment was set up. And, as and when people went down into the basement or somebody started a riff or whatever, just these grooves would start up and people would layer things and stuff like that. I mean, it was completely undisciplined and it was completely creative in a way I've never really experienced anything like that. And there were unbelievable musicians sort of coming in and out. I mean, people like Bobby Keys, Nicky Hopkins, Billy Preston, and they would come in and sort of add things. And the only discipline which I was told about was that I had to keep an eye out on Charlie Watts and Keith Richards, because there was when they started looking at one another, that normally meant that the Stones would go into a serious take. And so that was something that we had to really monitor. And you used to see it. As soon as they did that, the levels just kind of increased. But it was, somewhere there's got to be hundreds of these tapes of these jams. It was amazing.
And then when you got back from France, I believe Les Perrin kept you on, although I think you've mentioned he
got Parkinson's disease.
Yeah. But he then recommended you for a junior job at Essex Music.
Essex Music,
yeah. And Essex Music was looking after a lot of high-profile bands and artists. And again, it must have been like you landed on your feet. Especially at what age were you then? 18?
Yeah, I was about 18. But to be honest with you, the business side was a bit of a cultural shock, because I was actually more used to a different area of it. Through my mum, and it was a very kind of hedonistic, frontline, creative, mad style, beauty atmosphere of what I was dealing with. And so my experience was basically on the creative side. Les was, like I said, a one-man show. So that was the nearest that I've got to the business, the corporate business, if you like. I kind of thought that that's the way the business is. If you work for a publishing company, you get beautiful women turning up, and, you have parties going on all night and blah, blah, blah. So when I and to be fair, I really warmed to the lifestyle. It was a wonderful way of living.
But there was a great... Is that when you're talking about the Rolling Stones?
Well, the Rolling Stones in particular, but there was a great feeling of freedom, and there was a great feeling of no rules and breaking down boundaries. It was undisciplined, but there was a real search, and there was a real conviction for that search. So that was exciting. But then, I sort of interpret that as the business. And so when I first turned up at Essex Music, they thought I was an artist. They couldn't believe that I was actually, I turned up in cowboy boots and flared trousers and a leather studded jacket, and my hair was like really long and blonde. And So they couldn't, I mean, when I went into one of the departments, everyone was in suits. So it was, but I was very lucky because the guy that I work for is a guy called Don Paul. And he sort of warmed to me because he was quite Hollywood and he liked the idea of the sort of glamour rock kid turning up and working for him. And he sort of liked me because he knew that I used to, in New York, go to clubs. So, for example, in New York, used to regularly go to CBGB's and Studio 54, which are sort of two places that were really happening in those days. And so I think that he felt that I was, rather than somebody looking for a job, that actually I was music. I was kind of evolved at that, and he was brilliant, I have to say.
You've just now mentioned CBGB's and Studio 54, the biggest and most iconic clubs probably in the world in the 1970s. I know there's great music in these places, but also there's just loads of stories of the excesses there and excesses of New York. I mean, what was the sort of atmosphere at that time within the clubs and within New York generally?
New York, I love New York, but it was a crazy city. It was absolutely, there are a lot of no-go areas, Harlem in particular. Harlem, if you were white, you just couldn't go in there. They did do tours through Harlem, but the buses had grates on them, because as soon as they saw a tourist bus, you had things being thrown at it was, it was crazy. The one exciting area, a lot of people went into Greenwich Village, but the one exciting area at that time was 42nd Street, where basically law had broken down. And so there were just hundreds of funk clubs, soul clubs, drug dealers, porn venues. It was this unbelievable hubbub and people carrying guns and shit, But you didn't see anything like that in London at all. It was absolutely amazing. And everything in America was bigger. Cars were bigger, the buildings were bigger, the food was bigger, the coffee was big. Everything was bigger. But the thing that I really loved about it was that wherever you went, you talk about CBGB's and Studio 54, that is sort of part of New York. It wasn't regarded, Studio 54 was a bit exclusive, but most other places, just, CBGB's wasn't exclusive. It was just a place you used to hang out. It was a cool place. Studio 54 started off like that as well. And the two real areas of music in those days was in the club areas, it was disco, which was Studio 54. And you had this involvement of American punk and alternative music. And CBGB's historically was very, it's where the New York Dolls started. But it's also where Velvet Underground played, And so it was, I guess, again, I keep talking about being lucky, but there were certain things that were around that you had the opportunity to go to. And I went. And the fact is that, in terms of history, they become these special, iconic places. Studio 54 was crazy. That was mad. It was on 3 floors. Eventually, I got to the basement level, which is where it really all happened. And some of the stuff that I saw, it was just unbelievable. The famous Bianca Jagger on the white horse. But it wasn't, just that. It was insane,
And if you're saying it's insane, then
well, I was young. It was young then. I had to learn how to get to that level.
What, sink to the depths?
No, not at all. Rise to the heights.
We're going back to working at Essex Music. Did this have the sort of same feeling of the jobs you'd done before, and obviously this sort of feeling of New York?
No, it had nothing to do with it at all. It was extraordinary, really. It was literally, you had this incredible creativity in New York and this incredible outlet for music. When I walked into Essex Music, it was like walking into a bank. Everybody wore suits, for example. So it was a very, very different environment. It was a bit reminiscent of going back to school. But I was very lucky that I had a great boss. And there's a book to be written about him, a guy called Don Paul. And I started delving into things that, I just sort of found things that would take my interest. So because of my engineering work that I'd done, my tape ops that I'd done with the Stones, I knew how to sort of, set equipment up and stuff. And so on the publishing floor, there was a lounge, and I created a little kind of songwriting suite there, 4-track and stuff like that. So that was fun. And then I ended up doing, I ended up working with people like John Williams, the music composer. I ended up working with Clark Peters, who's, became a very famous Hollywood actor, Cleo Lane, Johnny Dankworth. I mean, and so that became like the demo studio of ideas that then later on progressed into studio work for all of them.
So you went in as an assistant to the boss.
Yeah.
And in a short space of time, you ended up engineering for the likes of John Williams.
I was just lucky. I mean, I had an idea. The equipment was there. I put it all together. I mean, John Williams liked the idea of coming in and just sort of trying things out and demoing things up before he actually records something. So I was just very lucky. And I've always had a curious mind, and and I thought I'll try and do something that I know. And so, I was just doing technical stuff at that time.
Were you sort of just determined? Were you pushy or? I mean, I
wasn't-
think
I
of the
was
word,
a-
I think of the word precocious because it's almost like or was it just simply determined?
What I, and I guess this goes back to my dyslexia a little bit. The one thing that I discovered, which I had a real affinity to and I had a real understanding, was music. I mean, music communicated to me, it communicated to me, cerebrally and sort of emotionally as well. So I was very lucky. And so anything to do with music, I was very confident about because I could understand. Anything to do with literature, I have a big problem with, because of my dyslexia. I just don't understand it. And of course, Essex Music, what they did do is they had this massive library, which was fantastic. So, I used to do the demos and I would delve into the library and check out music. They had the Sam Cooke catalogue, which, to me was just unbelievable. I mean, Sam Cooke, his songs were just unbelievable. So, I kept discovering things like that. And so, I made what was a boring bank job into something a bit more exciting for me. And it wasn't that I was bullshit or mouthy or I was actually quite shy. But as soon as I started talking about music, I just felt comfortable with that.
It sounds like you're doing really well at Essex Music. I mean, how did you feel like you were going to progress there?
I didn't really think about that. I mean, anything that was given to me musically, I saw as a conundrum, and I mean, looking back at it, I mean, I was, again, just very lucky. I ended up doing some sort of stuff which was just, I had no musical affinity to at all. I mean, I worked with Bruce Forsyth, Dennis King, Privates on Parade, a huge musical at the time. I got involved in putting Tommy together with Cameron McIntosh in the West End. But the things that really interested me were, I mentioned Sam Cooke. Pete Townsend had just finished an album with Ronnie Lane, which really interested me. They started recording the Who Are You album. I mean, that I found fascinating. They also control the back catalogue of Mark Bolan, which I found really interesting. So, those are the things that I would go to, but then I had a job to do as well. So then, Dennis King's and Privates on Parade was more of a job. And, the Who Are You album was more of a, sort of really where my heart was.
And there's also Bob Hope and Bing Crosby.
Oh, you heard about that, did you? Yeah. There used to be regular meetings, sort of creative meetings, and I was doing all this other stuff. But, one of the jobs that you've got to do is, find songs from the catalogue and place them with artists. And, which is a big, in those days, a big part of publishing. Every time I used to go into the meeting, they'd always ask me what cover I got and stuff like that. And to be fair, the people that I really liked were singer-songwriters. So I kind of struggled trying to find the right songs for other artists, to be frank. But I was a big lover of, the Bob Hope road movies, Bing Crosby and Dorothy Lamour. I mean, I love those. And at the time, there was a TV show called Two's Company with Elaine Stritch. And everybody was kind of waxing lyrical about owning the copyright for that song. And I just thought, what, I could just see Bob Hope and Bing Crosby doing this. And I just picked up the phone. I tracked down Bing Crosby's agent, rang him up, and then he told me, what was it he said? He said, Bing and Bob haven't worked for 15 years or something. So I just said, I've got a great song for them. Maybe they should work again together. And then I called Bob Hope's agent as well, did the same. And then sort of left it really. And then lo and behold, I got a call and they'd agreed to do the song, which was, anyhow.
Fantastic.
Life is always good and bad. I mean, the funny thing was, of course, that when I was asked what cover have you got, and I went, well, I got Bing Crosby and Bob Hope to cover Two's Company. I mean, the place just went completely silent. They were, they couldn't believe that this sort of young upstart would do something quite as classic as that. The irony of it, of course, was that Bing died on a golf course before it got recorded. But yeah, I got the cover.
Did you feel there was a gulf between what was happening in music and what Essex Music was doing and what the rest of the music industry was doing?
Look, there is I mean, historically, there has always been a huge gulf between what goes on in the streets and what the record companies see. I mean, in the 40s and 50s, it was a little bit more integrated. But, from the 60s onwards, it was very, very different. And so, really, the record companies, were quite antiquated and really had no idea about what was going on the streets. The Stones, for example, were really a happy accident, to be frank, as were the Beatles. I mean, neither of them were really kind of regarded by the labels as having the potential of some of them all kind of elder statesmen, like the Frank Sinatras and, the Cliff Richards and the Frankie Vallis. So, so they kind of did that. But particularly when I was in Essex Music, I mean, there was a complete revolution going on because, of course, punk was exploding at that time. And there was absolutely no relationship between what Essex Music did and what was going on in the streets.
Talking of which, did you get involved with punk and how did you see punk?
You had Essex Music doing their sort of, their what I call Muzak. And I mean, even the rock scene, which was beginning to sort of get a little bit kind of stale. It was becoming a kind of sad persona of its former self and didn't really relate to what was happening in the UK. I mean, the UK, sort of in the 70s, was a very dingy, depressed, down. Unemployment was very high. There was no opportunities. What the Eagles were doing, for example, with Hotel California didn't resonate with kids from Balham on a rainy January, afternoon. I mean, there's just no resonance about it. The fact is that no kid could afford a hotel in California, the drugs or the hookers. I mean, it was just sort of as simple as that. And also musically, what was happening at the time was that, it was quite complex what a lot of playing was going on. And it was very difficult for young kids to emulate that in the UK because you really had to be incredibly proficient in it. You just didn't have that evolvement musically. So punk really evolved as a kind of representation of the depression of what was going on in the 70s in the UK, in London in particular. Bands started to suddenly appear. I mean, the Pistols suddenly, I saw the Pistols at the Roxy. I mean, But then what also happened was culturally, kids kind of emulated the aggression of what was written about by the punk artists into their lifestyle. So the fashion became very cheap. I mean, people were wearing, safety pins as, jewelry, wearing distressed clothing. Everything was written more about apathy, about sort of depression. Kids unfortunately got into, sort of sniffing glue as an alternative of intoxication because, to be frank, they couldn't afford a beer. I mean, it's very, very depressed. I remember seeing the Sex Pistols at the Roxy. And I have to say, I mean, they weren't brilliant musically, but the energy that came off stage was awesome. And it really kind of reflected the aggression and the sort of feelings of young kids at that time. And they really responded to that. And then, you had bands like The Clash. I mean, they were brilliant live. I mean, the one that I really loved was X-Ray Specs. I adored Polystyrene.
So if you're working at Essex Music and it's quite, should we say, conservative,
Yeah.
how were you going to try and persuade them or any sort of record company to start picking up these sort of punk bands or these new bands?
Look, I think when I saw particularly Polly, to be honest with you, I mean, she was only about 15 when I saw her first, and I saw her, I think it was at the Vortex. I can't remember where, I think it was at the Vortex, but I saw her wearing, she made a dress out of a plastic rubbish bag and she wore like a Wehrmacht Nazi helmet and, she had braces on her teeth. She came from sort of a mixed cultural background. But, what really resonated with me was here was a woman screaming things like, "Oh, bondage up yours," and screaming identity, screaming germ-free adolescence. And these songs really kind of resonated. And the songs were great. I mean, if you listen to them now, Germ-Free Adolescence is a beautiful song. So I thought, this is happening. And so somehow I have to introduce this to the company. And it wasn't easy because, to be frank, media basically rejected punk and didn't see it as a cultural movement. what they saw it was just bad musicians. I mean, this was their view. They weren't like the Beatles. I mean, of course they weren't. They were their own people. And again, I was lucky. My boss, Don Paul, was a bit of a supporter. And so I told him about X-Ray Specs and I invited him to a gig. And, like I said, he was very Hollywood, Pumas and, really beautiful leather jackets made made in Italy and stuff like that. So he turned up at a gig, very coiffured looking, very glamorous. And, I said, you better stand at the back. And he went, no, I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this for many years, young man. I'm going to the front. So I said, okay. And I always remember this. And as soon as X-Ray Specs came on, he was right at the front and the whole place started pogoing. But the thing that really struck me was that everyone started spitting and you saw the spit flying across the venue. I mean, it looked like the arrows of Agincourt landing on poor old Don. And poor old Don couldn't get out. I mean, eventually had to pogo out. But to give him credit, I mean, I love him to death, but, he went, this is amazing. I mean, he just saw the reaction of the kids and he understood what it is. And then he helped me get the publishing deal, yeah. So that's how they got signed. And then I kept in touch with Polly most of her life, actually, even when she became a Hare Krishna as well at one point, which a lot of people don't know. Her and Laura Logic. I love Polly. It was so sad to hear that she died, but she was, in my opinion, one of the great. I mean, she did only really one album, but she was one of the great punk artists. I mean, she was a pioneer.
And I just love the idea of
She had grills before rap even happened.
So she's your favourite. Always found it funny, like the idea of him pogoing his way out.
Well, it was the only way you could get out, to be honest with you.
Just imagine
he wasn't too happy.
Person with a kind of coiffed hair and a leather
honestly,
jacket,
he was
pogoing away.
Brilliant, yeah.
And with the onset of the 1980s, and to be honest, you after we've heard you talking about all the jobs you've been in, you'd have thought by the 1980s you must have been like middle-aged.
No.
But it was like, I mean, what were you, 24, 25? And obviously wanting to get into A&R, and you ended up being an A&R person.
I worked for a lot of publishers, and a publishing deal was always a secondary deal for most artists. The place that, really, everything stemmed from was the release of records, working for record companies. And that was really being on the front line. And so that's really what I wanted to do. I worked for a number of publishing companies. And then I got a lucky break. I got a job offer as an assistant A&R manager at RCA.
Obviously, you were involved in signing up bands like X-Ray Specs. But can you elaborate on how you go about discovering a band and what the process is from discovering a band to them being signed up?
Oh, God, that's $1 million question, isn't it? The process is searching out bands that, have the material, the capability of performing, have the ability of, cut long story short, the most important thing for me is voice and sound. And particularly with the voice. I mean, the voice is something that is absolutely vital for me. It doesn't have to be technically good, but there's got to be some kind of essence of originality in it. Something that you can just, as soon as you hear it, you know who it is. It goes back to what I learned about music. So for example, if you take the sort of, middle of the road artist, Frank Sinatra, as soon as you hear Frank Sinatra, the fact that he's technically brilliant is good, but you can recognize his voice immediately. As soon as you hear Mick Jagger, who's not technically brilliant, you still know exactly who it is. And that kind of identification and originality with the voice is the most important thing for me. Then comes the sound. I mean, is the sound prevalent to the day? So punk, the punk sound, I adored. It was this kind of wall of sound of just sheer, energy and noise, and it was exciting. So that to me is kind of secondary thing. So I never discovered the talent. It's an odd thing. In all my career, I was never sent a tape that I picked up on as a new artist. It was very much, going around, hanging around, being in clubs, spotting things and hoping that you're going to be in the middle of something that, you can identify, really. I think that's the key to A&R, is being able to identify something which is special.
Once you've discovered a band, how do you then go about sort of nurturing that band or artist with an eye to them being both an artistic success and, well, and hopefully a commercial success?
I mean, I have my own way of doing it. I mean, I think the first thing that's really important is that you've got to be. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I'm like a sponge. You've got to absorb every kind of music and have a clear sense of history. I mean, that's one thing that people really don't understand about music, is that when you actually make a recording, that is a statement for life. You have to understand that if you've got it right, that is history. So I understood that, when we did Sweet Dreams, or, with Sade or whoever. So that's very important. You've got to be pretty courageous, because you've got to dive into the creative zone. And actually, when you go into the creative zone, you've got to utilize your vulnerabilities. I mean, that's something that you can't be too protective. You've got to let your emotions, and you've got to become like almost this conduit to have ideas and emotions come through you. So it's kind of a slightly frightening place, to be frank, because, all the barriers come down. But it's also the kind of most exciting. In terms of what you're looking for in a studio, you're always looking for that sort of slightly unique, that little quirky thing. It could be just a tiny little sound. Always got to have your ears sort of just attentively hearing something that you could maybe put into repetition, or could make a hook or whatever. So that's important, and you've got to have very, very acute hearing, in my view. I mean, the other part of that is that you kind of got to be free of prejudice, because you never really know where a sparkle of genius will come from. So you can't, I've often seen people, people used to be, they're always just a tape op, for example. But, a tape op can be as valuable in a creative process as the producer or as a top musician. So you've got to be aware where these little quirks come from. That sort of leads on to the subjectivity. You can't be objective about it. You have to be subjective, because you've got to allow your emotions to come through. Because again, you're making judgments about the internal feelings of the relationship between the music and your soul. So that's very important. I mean, after that, then you've got to be prepared for severe criticism. So there's a very kind of difficult change you have to make. You've got to go from being subjective to being objective. Because when you've done something, you've got to believe that it's good. It can't be you think it's good, or maybe it's good. If you've done it right, you've got to have that belief, and then people will criticize it if it's you never had an A&R man. I mean, we sort of mentioned Jefferson Aeroplane, for example. We just had a laugh about that earlier. But you would never have a record company person going in, write a song about a white rabbit. I mean, they just wouldn't do it. Or you wouldn't have somebody go in, to Queen and go, from a record label, and go, write an operatic song. Or to Led Zeppelin, why don't you write a song about a staircase? I mean, these are absolute classics that come out of these kind of creative moments. And when you've done something like that, I mean, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when Bohemian Rhapsody was delivered to the record company. I would have done. But, from my understanding, Freddie Mercury was absolutely convinced about it. And the A&R go, well, it's not 3 minutes. And it's like, well, no, it's not. And he was a great example of somebody that would go, no, I've done this, is great. I believe in this. And you as an A&R person, you've got to be part of that. You've got to join that. You've got to understand, is this brilliant or isn't it? And if you think it is, you've got to stand up for it. I mean, it is quite complicated. You've also got to create a comfortable environment for the artists that you work with. They've got to feel, if artists don't feel that they can trust you, I mean, and this is a big problem with a lot of A&R. I mean, we've touched upon this, but, people don't trust A&R people. Why? Because they work for the record company. Because there is, as far as they're concerned, all they're interested in is to manipulate that. But if you want your artist to deliver the things that become become commercially successful, you've got to make them feel comfortable with their art. Everything is there for them to be that conduit. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not all pro artist. I mean, I think that what you can do is create great art this way, and then you mix it with a kind of objectivity of business. And like the songs that I've just mentioned, Bohemian Rhapsody in particular, there was an absolutely unique song that crossed over all of the kind of barriers. The record company did a great job, put the money, they did the marketing, blah, blah, blah. And then you had that special success. So I guess, I guess the sort of conclusion of that is most talented people struggle with the idiots that were hired by the record companies.
So let's talk about Annie Lennox and Dave Stewart of the Eurythmics. Tell me about how you came across them and the process of working with them.
It was a kind of happy accident, really, to be honest with you. I went to a show, I can't remember the exact venue, and the Eurythmics were actually playing. And I remember going to the show, and I remember this new instrument, actually, that I saw, which was a electric guitar and a bass stuck together that was kind of hanging off a hook, really. And it was sort of in midair, and you had that was lit, and then you had the sort of Mike and Annie, which is, just for her. It's a very, very simple little gig. I think it was a track called Belinda that they did. And I remember watching it, and my jaw just dropped, to see one musician playing bass and electric guitar together was unbelievable. But then to hear Annie's voice, I was just completely rocked. I mean, it was a kind of, I kind of felt as emotional about hearing a voice as I did when I heard great soul singers. And that was unusual for the UK because, that it all came from America, really. And so that's how I saw it. I just kind of put it in the back of my head thinking, this is a great band, and I'd love to sort of check them out and, see how it's going. And then I got a job at RCA. And then my first brief was basically to look through the contemporary roster, about 30 artists. And, and then lo and behold, they were there. I mean, I couldn't believe it. And I sort of went through the roster, and they were the only music that I really wanted to work with. I mean, the rest of them, it was okay, but it wasn't special. So I remember going to my boss and, I said, I've gone through the roster and blah, blah, blah. And he goes to me, he says, which ones do you want to keep? So I said, actually, the Eurythmics is the only one. And he basically went white. So I said, are you right? And he goes, well, we've just dropped them. So I said, to be frank, I would drop the whole roster and just keep them. When he sort of was taken aback a little bit. And then to give him credit, he sort of scuttled off and got them re-signed. He re-signed them. And then I had to meet them for the first time. And I think Annie was doing a photo session with this brilliant photographer called Gerald Mankiewicz, if I remember rightly. And so we met on the session, and Dave was very warm. Annie was a little bit cold, only because I think that they'd been struggling quite a lot. And I think being dropped might have been a big shock. And, and I spent, we went out for dinner and we just spent some time together. And by the end of the dinner, I think that there was a kind of quizzical look on their faces because I don't think they'd come across somebody, like me, for example, that kind of, I guess, maybe understood a little bit more about the creative process and was less of the businessman. And we developed a relationship from there, really. I was never the typical A&R guy. I learned working with the Stones, to be frank, and, sort of working, going to my mum's sessions and stuff like that. The one thing that I really did learn is that the most important thing that you must do with an artist is to try and create the right environment for them to maximize their talents. I mean, it's a very sort of simple view. We just kind of developed an idea. And the way it worked with them, which was great, would be Dave would sort of ring me up and come shooting over. And I remember when they wrote This Is the House, and he went, oh, I'm just working on this bass part. And it was just so kind of cool and kind of aggressive, but really kind of, and I could see it going on the dance floor and stuff. And I got very excited about it. And that's how we developed the album. He used to pop in and go, what do you think? What do you think? And eventually there was enough trust between us to, use me as a sounding board. And then we were very specific about it. My favorite track actually on the album is The Walk. I mean, I still think to this day that to me, that's one of the great songs they've ever written. And Sweet Dreams and Love is a Stranger were actually written at the end. But, they had to go through this process of rediscovery in order to get to their peak in terms of their writing.
Going back to this idea of the A&R person, I mean, obviously you were very much more involved within the creative process with them.
Well, I wasn't so involved in the creative process. I was very much a sounding block.
Yeah.
And I think that what they felt was that there was somebody that knew about music, and I have very good taste in music. I pride myself with that even to this day. And though at first they found it a little bit odd, the kind of brutality of some of my comments, they began to warm to it because they realized that for me, it wasn't about my position. It wasn't about anything other than trying to make the best out of whatever they're trying to create. And so they had they had a sounding block that, they could respect rather than, go in and somebody sitting there reading a paper, reading Music Week and going, well, I'm not sure about, in one of those people, and so we built the tracks up, so Sweet Dreams was basically written in my office, which a lot of people don't realize. And that to me is why, I mean, if you take that one song, that to me is why I love the business and A&R in particular so much, because, when you're creating something, there's a great purity and a great honesty to it. And what I really, really love is this kind of ability for artists to be conduits, to pull ideas out of nowhere and so, and to come out with what is probably still one of their biggest records.
I know you really enjoyed working with them, but I get the impression they weren't so liked by, well, anyone in the music industry.
They were the most unpopular people I've ever come across, I have to say. I mean, absolutely. Everyone thought they were just very weird. All right. And they couldn't, they didn't fit into the normal, genre. I was always warned that they were very difficult. And I have to say, I had no difficulties with either Dave or Annie ever. I mean, our conversations were very, we used to have a laugh. We used to talk about music. I think that they felt comfortable in the way that they were able to make art. And that was very much what I tried to do with them, and I didn't find them weird at all. I just thought that they were kind of interesting. They were really hated. I mean, to be frank, everyone, the press hated them, radio hated them, the record company hated them, distributors hated them, PR, everybody hated them, but I absolutely adored them. There was just something, well, there is. I mean, Annie is one of the greatest white female soul singers, certainly ever to come out of the UK. And probably in the world.
And I believe there was someone else who quite liked him at RCA.
Oh God!
Think of the teeth.
Dear, oh dear, oh dear. Well, I went through a period where I really struggled. I mean, to get I was never given the right budgets. And actually, to be fair, that was one of the great things of working with Dave. Is that recording budgets, for example, on average in those days were about £75,000. Our budget was 15,000, which was nothing. I mean, it was absolutely nothing. And Dave was brilliant with that because what Dave would do was he'd be able to cut out costs. And so, ironically, I mean, we created this kind of, computerized neo soul based on the fact that we didn't have budgets. And so he was getting drum machines, he was getting engineers in, he was getting guest musicians onto it. So Dave was a huge help in developing all of this. I mean, he really was, where we couldn't afford to put drums on in a studio, he'd got a drum machine. And so that was great. So I was struggling. I mean, it was, everywhere I go, I'd go with great enthusiasm. People go, yeah, but they're weird. And it's like, no, listen to this. Oh, no, they're straight, And this has always been my problem with the record industry is the kind of the juxtaposition between what I could see musically and how other people view it. I've realized now that I've got old is that, I have an empathy to music and most people don't have it. They say they do, but they don't. And so I was getting pretty down because I was thinking, why am I struggling with something that is so brilliant? And there was a artist liaison guy called Tony McGrogan, and he sort of popped his head into my office one day and goes, can you come out to lunch? And I went, sure. I thought I was having lunch with him. And then we went to this restaurant. And then lo and behold, there was David Bowie sitting there. And so we got introduced. And from that point on, Bowie was a huge, I mean, it was, look, we sat down, we got on like a house on fire. He's a very funny guy. So we sort of had, quite a few. Well, I jokingly went, I said, did people tell you look like me? And he laughed at that. He thought that was quite funny. But, we just sort of started chatting away. And I kind of bemoaned it. And I went, what I don't understand is why, people hate this music so much. And he just said, you know what, Jack? RCA, they've hated me since I signed to them. And just that little statement sort of set me off again, because it was like, well, you know what? If David Bowie likes this, fuck the rest. And that's really the kind of attitude I took from that point on. And he was great. He used to send me little messages and all sorts of stuff.
So, with this sort of encouragement, what were your next steps with the Eurythmics?
The album had been completed. Sweet Dreams and Love is Strange had been completed, and I started sort of playing the tracks around all the different departments. And I went to the marketing department and said, what are you going to do for us? And they went, well, we'll give you a range bag, which was basically putting the single in an RCA bag, which I thought, oh, I'm not going to have any of this. And so I suddenly realized that the only way that I can do anything with them is by finding periphery people to help. And so I learned from the Stones, because when the Stones did the tongue logo, they went to the Royal College of Art and they pulled somebody out of there. So I went to the Royal College of Art looking, for somebody, and found a young 19-year-old student, actually, a guy called Lawrence Stevens, no relative at all. He was coming up ideas. So I put him together with Dave and Annie, and that whole thing evolved. And then MTV was beginning to sort of start happening. And I kind of realized that, MTV is going to be a very important medium, particularly the way that Dave and Annie looked. I mean, Dave, the mad professor, and Annie with this kind of androgynous look. I mean, from a photographic point of view, it was great, but we needed to get a visual. So I went down to the marketing division and said, I think we need to make a video. And they kind of laughed at me. And I knew in the back of my mind that if I didn't have a video on this act, I was screwed. I mean, I really did. And so on a sort of certain hedonistic Friday night, I strolled down to the marketing division, pulled out a purchase order, commissioned a company called John Roseman Associates to do 2 videos, Love is a Stranger and Sweet Dreams, with budgets of, I think, 20,000 each, and forged the head of marketing signature on the purchase order. And that's how the videos got made. I mean, I got away with it to the point that it went into production. And it was the director who rang me up and he goes, Jack, are you something dodgy being done with these videos? So I said, why? He said, well, there's some people that are after you. And I went, who's that? And he mentioned the head of marketing. And I went, oh, Christ. And then I thought, you know what, I'll disappear. So I went skiing in Switzerland. I thought, I'm not going to face this. And then while I was skiing, I thought, you know what, screw it. I mean, I'm going to stand by my guns. I believe in this artist. I believe in what I'm doing. And I came back and they were doing a gig at this venue. And up to that point, the sort of, we were getting decent crowds, but it wasn't filling out. And so I arrived at this venue and there's about 1,500 people outside. So I thought, Christ, they haven't opened the doors yet. And when I went in, it was completely filled out. There's obviously the buzz had started on this band. And I remember going up on a balcony in this venue and the whole of the record label was there, including the MD. And Dave and Annie came up, and Annie spotted me and winked and smiled, and I smiled back. And they rocked the place, and and I thought, you know what, if they're going to fire me, at least I've done the job here. Yeah, and then I got pulled up by the MD, who absolutely bollocked me, absolutely, completely and utterly bollocked me. But by that time, the momentum was such that it was actually Love is a Stranger was exploding. It was a guy called Don Ellis. I mean, he's dead now, but I really liked him. And he just said, you know what, Jack, don't ever fucking do that again. Said, if you've got a problem, come to me. And I said, well, as long as I can do that, I'll absolutely do that. And then, of course, Love is a Stranger won the Best Video Award that year, which I wasn't allowed to collect. the director of marketing had to collect that, but I wasn't allowed to do that. And then Sweet Dreams as well. And then, of course, MTV picked up on it, and then it exploded in America. I never realised, actually, till recently, that they had a #1 single and a #1 album all at the same week in America. So that's pretty phenomenal for a 15 grand album.
Another big act that you were involved in the 1980s was Sade.
I was always out and about, and then I heard about this band called Pride. And I remember going to them, and to be frank, I wasn't that impressed with the band. But the one thing that happened through the show was that there was a backing vocalist, and I throughout the whole set, all I could hear, which is unusual for me, is just the backing vocal. All I could hear was this voice, just the backing vocals, Anyhow, I saw the show, and they were managed by Lee Barrett and a lawyer called Brian Carr. And they sort of came to see me. I said, I'm not very keen on your band, But I just said, but you know what? If you want to do something with a backing vocalist, I'll do something. So they, just refused point blank, and I thought, well, and I went to another show and I thought, well, maybe I'm going mad. And then the same thing happened again. I was, sort of at this show, and the only thing I could hear was the backing vocals, just that voice. It was the only thing that I could hear. And so I rang them up and I said, look, you've got a definite deal with me if you let me do something with Sade. And they went, well, and they sort of came back to me, and then they went, we'll do 2 deals. And I went, what's that? They said, we'll do a deal with Pride and we'll do a deal with Sade separately. And I said, I don't want to do a deal with Pride, just want to do a deal with Sade. And also I could see that there was a kind of relationship on stage with the guy called Stuart Matthewman, I think his name was. And I said, I'd like to do something with the 2 of them. And, eventually they agreed. So I managed to get a budget to do proper. I wanted to go further than just demos. I wanted to do proper recordings. And my big conundrum with Sade was, because she's got a slightly African tint to her soulfulness, to her jazziness. And I really felt that, whoever worked with her needed to have an understanding of that. And I was working with a guy who was the Pretenders publicist, who's a guy called Clive Banks. And Clive introduced me to Robin Miller, and I listened to a load of his work. And he'd done a lot of work with African artists, but he was basically jazz-based. And I thought, you know what? This would be a great combination. So, I commissioned, with permission, the actual recording. And so they went into Robin's studio, and the first 2 tracks they cut was Your Love Is King and Smooth Operator.
And these 2 tracks were on the 10 million selling 1984 album Diamond Life.
Yeah, I mean, they were the full recordings.
However, your record company, RCA, paid for these recordings that you were doing, but they didn't end up signing Sade.
I had a new MD, and I won't mention his name because he's all right. I played him the tracks, and he did the classic sort of, crappy A&R comment of, I don't see these. And I kind of went, well, I want to sign it. And he didn't want to do the deal. And I said, well, yeah, but we've just spent the money to record it all. I mean, we've got masters. And he just didn't want to do the deal. I remember walking away from there, and I thought, this is kind of a little bit off. I mean, I broke the rhythmics from nowhere. I mean, I had Joe boxes all over the place. Bow Wow Wow was exploding in America. I just signed the Below Monkeys. And I thought the least he could do is just give me a bit of respect and go, you know what, Jack, because of what you've done. And he didn't want to do it. He was very stubborn about it. And, and I just thought, that's it. I can't work like this. And so I left RCA.
Not surprisingly, because
the tracks went to fucking CBS. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So, because it's like RCA initially dropped the Eurythmics, and then they didn't sign Sade, and then David Bowie left for EMI as well. So, anyway. So Obviously,
I tell you, look, there is and now that I'm near my 70s, I'm sort of quite confident in my belief. I've been very lucky in terms of when I was born, and I've been very lucky that in a way my dyslexia has caused me to have an affinity with music. So at that time, didn't I kind of thought everybody had the same ears as I did. The fact is they didn't. And so I don't hold any resentment towards that. But, my expectations were, well, why can't you hear it? Well, not everybody can, is the reality. And to be fair to the MD, he did apologise to me at Chris Blackwell's 25th year anniversary party.
Right, what a better place to apologise. That's brilliant.
But there's a lot of bullshit about Sade. I mean, a lot of people have claimed it. The fact is that if I hadn't stepped in, she may have not had a solo career.
I presume that then people reckon they'd discovered Sade.
The hardest thing that and it did sort of set me off on a hedonistic path. The hardest thing that I really found I couldn't deal with is people couldn't see things before something happened, and it does baffle me even to this day how. If you take hip hop, for example, why record companies haven't learned that, the youth culture is a view to the future. I really struggle with that. And I really struggle with the fact that not being part of something and then jumping on the bandwagon afterwards and then trying to be really nice to me about, slapping me on the back and going, we knew you would. And it's like, well, no, you didn't. You weren't there. What you did was you were negating what we were trying to do, because it's easier to be negative than it is to be positive. And so that was something that I struggled. And, but I would say that probably the most important thing for me on reflection about all of this is I know what I've done. I know what I did with the Eurythmics. I know what I did with Sade. I know what I did with the Rolling Stones. So I have no issues with that. Now, the fact that people claimed it, well, that's down to you. That's bullshit. But I will go to my grave knowing what I've done with my teeth.
Do
I sound like a bitter old man?
Just because we talked about two bands that made it because you obviously helped them on. What allows a band or makes a band so-called make it?
Well, it's a number of things. I mean, I've always felt that there's no crime in great art being commercial. To me, that goes hand in hand. If you take something like Slumdog Millionaire as a movie. I mean, it is a great bloody movie. There's no harm in that being successful, in my opinion. And the same with the art, but not everybody's like that. So, I mean, if you take somebody like the Pixies, who I think are absolutely brilliant, or Tame Impala, who I think are brilliant as well. They have their own path. They're not necessarily in love with, the sort of the commerciality of what they do. And in many ways are underrated, but to real music lovers, they have a real influence.
And do you ever become friends with the artist, or how do you keep your relationship with the people you work with?
Yeah, I'm asked that a lot. The easiest thing to do is become mates. When an artist is successful, the pressure on people within a record company is to befriend the artist. I personally prefer to have a sort of, a cordial relationship with an artist, simply because if you become too friendly with an artist, they do have a tendency, to, put emotional pressure on you. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing an artist can have is to have somebody that they respect, won't always like what they hear, but at least they respect that and gives them something to think. So I never like getting too close to an artist.
In the same sort of vein, did you ever get involved with any of the old pop star antics of the excess?
Yeah, I mean, I was known as the Keith Richards of A&R, so that will. But again, I mean, that was the era. So I mean, it just
it just was. No, because I'm just thinking what pressure that might. I obviously I know you've got a daughter. I don't know whether you were married at the time, but what pressure that might have put on family life.
Not that much, really, to be honest. No, I mean, look, I taught my daughter in a particular way. Drugs, for example. I mean, I had an instance with my daughter where she must have been about 6 or 7, and we were in a park in Chiswick. There was some youths, smoking, and she was just playing, near them. And then a policeman arrived, and she came running over. And she went, Daddy, what is marijuana? What is cannabis? And I went, how on earth do you know that? She said, oh, the policeman asked me if I was smoking it. And I was sort of taken aback, and I thought, wow, I'm going to have to talk to her about drugs right now, And I was very open about it. I said to her, look, whatever anybody says about drugs, everybody's very negative about them, and they go, look, they're bad for you, bad, 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 don't. I said, the reality is actually they're great. That's the big myth about drugs, that everybody goes around saying that they're terrible. They're not. If you do drugs, 9 times out of 10, you become euphoric. So you feel great. And I think that's the big mistake that people make about drugs, is that they don't, they try and knock it. Drugs only become bad when you live for them. But, that's what alcoholics go through. So are you telling me alcohol's bad? I did have to sort of teach her, and she's, she's a DJ. I mean, she's very level about, drug taking, only because I think I talked to her about it.
And what,
I love drugs, by the way. I've got nothing against drugs whatsoever. And everybody used to go, oh, you're there's something wrong with you. And it's like, well, not really. I just love them, And when I decided to stop, I just stopped. So, I wasn't an addict.
And am I right to assume you weren't the only person in the record industry to indulge in such behaviour?
Have you seen that movie, The Wolf of Wall Street? That was the 80s and record labels. And that's how it, and there were casualties as a result of it. And I've lost some, great friends. I mean, Matthew Eshman from Bowies, the guitarist, died of a heroin overdose. There's some people that can't handle it, and they need to be careful. But they wouldn't do it if it was bad and nasty and horrible, and you've got a bad feeling from it. That's controversial, isn't it?
No, it's Jack sitting on the fence again. You're going to get splinters, you are.
There's a lot of myths about music in that era, and there were a lot of drugs. There's no question about it. And anybody that says there weren't there. I had the opportunity of meeting a guy called Russ Reagan, who ran Casablanca Records. He was the only white guy who ever became MD of Motown Records, and I once asked him, I said, what were your A&R meetings like? And he, was quite candid about it. He said, we used to have a big round conference table, and on a Friday night, the dealer would come in, and on the circumference of the table, he would just do one giant line of cocaine, and we would all go in there and sniff, and we would do our A&R meeting. And I said, how long did that used to last? And he went, 3 days. But that's, that's history there. I mean, another person who unfortunately got shot by his stripper girlfriend, a guy called Charlie Minor, who did radio promotion. I mean, he was involved in promoting the Eurythmics, and I had dinner once with him, and I said, how did you manage to get such extensive play on key stations in America? And he said, really easy, ounces of cocaine and Harley Davidsons. So that's the era that we lived in. That's what happened all of the time. I rather be open about this, because the problem I've always had with the business, and it's going back to, whether or not you want to be close to artists. Artists really do need to have people that they can trust around them, and they don't. And in the case of Michael Jackson, he trusted a doctor, and the doctor gave him an overdose, simply because he was earning $100,000 a year, and basically murdered him, in my opinion. So it's things like this that I kind of, certainly now that I'm a lot older and my daughter's growing up and I've got grandchildren, if you try and hide all of this, then, you're just going to have the same old problem. The truth is that people need the truth. And if you don't get the truth, then accidents happen. And, the same way that it did with Prince, the same way it did with Whitney Houston, somebody needed to get it. I mean, I met Whitney Houston, because I did some work at Bobby Brown's studio. I mean, she's lovely, wonderful person, but she obviously had a problem. Somebody needed to go to her and go, look, just sort yourself out. And nobody would. Everybody's too frightened to tell the truth. And, and I think that's the great tragedy of the entertainment business.
And then you moved with your stepdad to Cyprus. How did that come about, and what was the thinking behind that?
To be honest with you, both of us were getting, what's the word to describe it? We're getting a bit worn out with people demanding of us. With my dad, I mean, at the time, I think he was the associate editor for the Daily Mail. He couldn't really go anywhere without somebody trying to come and sell a story or give him a story and stuff like that. And I mean, I think we touched on it earlier. I couldn't leave the record labels that I was working for by the front door, certainly on a Friday. Because if I did that, then there'll be, a dozen or so people waving tapes. I mean, everywhere I used to go and they found out that I worked in a record label or I'd signed the Eurythmics or whatever, you'd be amazed at how many, relatives are singers in the world. I mean, it was quite frightening, So he saw I was getting a bit worn out and he was getting a bit fed up. And he was looking for a stringer, a journalist for the Middle East. And he tracked somebody down in Cyprus, which was the perfect location for the Middle East. So we went over there and we just fell in love with the island. I mean, the island was, in those days, it was a frontier, basically. It wasn't part of the EU, it was part of the Middle East. And it was just this amazing microscope to the past. And it was crazy. I mean, the Cypriots love music. And so, I mean, already things were happening in Ayia Napa. Limassol was completely rocking. I mean, it was just absolutely insane what was going on there. But it was just it's the birthplace of Aphrodite, And we just fell in love with it. And then, and we had complete anonymity there. Nobody really knew who we were. And so we purchased a property there that I eventually moved into. You used to be able to go and find deserted beaches. And I mean, it was awesome. I mean, the Mediterranean's beautiful there. I used to do my conference calls from the beach and I used the Mediterranean as my backdrop, so that really wound people up. They all thought it was a photographic backdrop until I went swimming.
So, and it's not like you to try and wind people up.
No, I know. But it, it was just this very, very special place.
Having left RCA, you went on to work at MCA and CBS with quite a diverse bunch of artists and bands such as Judas Priest, Musical Youth, Patsy Kensit and Nick Kershaw. Now, this would have kept most people busy enough, but you were also running clubs and parties and what would become like the precursor to raves. Can you give me a flavour of that time and the events you put on, which I also believe at this period you refer to it as your dark ages?
It was, yeah. I mean, it was what I call the dark ages. But I mean, I really didn't sleep during this period. Is the truth of the matter, because I was working during the day and I was doing my own clubs at night. And I was very intrigued with dance music. I mean, we've already touched upon the fact that I went to Studio 54. The dance scene was really breaking open. I mean, the Chicago house parties that had come over here. I mean, it's very interesting. In America, you had all of these house parties, but they were all predominantly black. And if you talk to any of the DJs in the States, they were completely shocked at the knowledge of the sort of this English movement that came about that really supported that music. I mean, they were importing those records. And so I did one of the very first acid house parties in Clink Street. Not so much raves, but, sort of, I did this, it's just that I worked with a couple of guys called Spike and Neville. We used to do a lot of events and stuff. And, they were all illegal, basically. They were all underground. And we used to let people know, doing flyers and little messages. And, we used to get great DJs. I mean, the DJ was a very important part. I did stuff with Sean McCluskey as well. He's quite well known in that area. But I remember one where they booked, I didn't know that there was even a film studio. They booked Battersea Film Studios in Battersea. And, and everybody got really excited because it was one of our bigger events. The studio could hold about 1,500 people. And then the day before we were going to do the event, and by which time all the flyers were out and all the information was out, and we were already getting responses to the people that were coming, and it was like, I walk around the studio. And then to my horror, I discovered there's a bloody police station just behind the studio. And I just went back to the guys and I went, honestly, have you checked the area? And they go, yeah. And I said, well, there's a fucking police station next door. And you could just see everybody's faces like sort of drop because, we were going to get busted in it. And I remember I thought, there's just no way that I could get out of this, And then eventually I just walked into the police station and I went, excuse me, can I have a chat with somebody? And they went, yeah, what is it? And I went, I'm a film director and I'm going to be filming a rave at the studio there. But I want you to understand it's for a movie. It's not a real rave. All right. So, can you, are you going to be all right with that? And they went, yeah, sure, no problem. If it's for a movie, just go ahead and do that. And so we managed to get away with that party until about 5 o'clock in the morning when the police realised that I'd lied through my teeth because they saw all of our doormen taking cash at the door. And then, but it was kind of scary because we used to have quite heavyweight executives coming. So it was, it was like I really didn't want to get busted. And I really didn't want any of those executives getting busted because they used to really leave our parties very much worse for wear. But that actually led me on to, the thing with the ministries, really.
I want to now step into the 1990s and find out about your work on the Ministry of Sound label and what did happen at the Houses of Parliament.
As you can see from my background, I love both sides. I loved sort of rock and roll and I loved club disco music back in the day, And even though I had a day job, I used to do my own clubs. And so I was involved in sort of probably the first acid house parties in London, basically underground illegal clubs. But that's what was happening all around the world at that time. And so you were having garage parties and stuff like that. And I love the Ministry. I mean, the Ministry was, sort of set up as a classic American, warehouse with probably the best sound system in Europe. And it was a rocking place. I used to, pop in there. I mean, I never had a drinks license, which always made me laugh. That was always a funny thing. Well, they didn't need one. But I got introduced to James Palumbo, who basically was the owner. They knew of what I'd done in records. And they kind of knew that I was sort of doing club stuff. And so, he said, how about starting up a label? And so, we just had open discussion. And at that time, there'd never been a proper representation of what went on in a club done officially. I mean, there are lots of DJs made cassettes and they would sell cassettes, in markets and places like that of, what they did. But there wasn't at that time, and anyhow, they had this idea that what they wanted to do was sort of pick a load of tracks and, and just sort of license them into an album. And I talked to them and I said, what would be better would be, if we actually captured a moment from the club, a moment, between 3 and 4, in the morning in the club, and they were intrigued with that. And because they had the best PA system in Europe, I talked to, there was one brilliant DJ called Tony Humphreys. And so I sat down with him and just had a kind of chat with him and said, would you be prepared to give me your best set list during the night? And he said, sure. And then we picked enough tracks to do an album. And then I said, if I get these tracks, would you do a live mix that we would then record and then, sort of press up as a record? So he said, no problem at all. So I talked to James and I said, look, I'd like to do this. And he was up for it. He, gave me a budget. And so, off I went. And, again, in life, I've always been very lucky. I mean, some of the tracks, one track that they wanted was a mix of Gabrielle Dreams, which was a #1 record. So I kind of dreaded ringing up the record label thinking, God knows what they're going to ask me. It's probably the whole budget. And I remember she was on Charisma. I rang up Charisma and I was having a chat with them. And they sort of laughed at me, going, Ministry of Sound, you wouldn't be able to afford it. So I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the 7-inch goes for like 50 grand. So I said, yeah, but I don't want the 7-inch. And there was this silence on the phone, and they went, well, what do you want? I said, I want this mix on this 12-inch. I gave them the name of the mix. And they went, you want that? So I said, yeah. How much? And he was so taken aback that I wanted this obscure bit of instrumentation. He went, oh, we'll give it to you for 250 quid. I always remember that. And so, I started ringing around the record company. This was the same, Darren Emerson mixes, Shakespeare's Sister. We were just getting these mixes next to nothing. So we were well in budget. And I had about 500 quid left out of the budget. And we managed to license everything. And the tracks that we couldn't get, Tony would give us alternative ones. And so we had basically the set. So we did that. So we did all of the recordings, got it all mastered out, and I went to James and I said, look, we need to market this now. What's the budget? And he said to me, well, I've given you the budget. And then I suddenly dawned on me that I've just made a big faux pas, because basically the budget he gave us was for recording and marketing. And like I said, I got about 600 or 700 quid left of the budget. And that was what the marketing campaign was going to be. So I thought, oh, fucked up here. And I was, leaving the club. Just as I left the club, there was a guy with a projector out there, sort of projecting things. And I don't know what made me say it, but I said, excuse me. And he goes, yeah. I said, can you, with your projector, is your projector sophisticated enough to project the Batman logo on a cloud? And he went to me, I can project anything you like on anything, mate. So I went, okay. So I said, how much? He went, 400 quid. I went, what do you need? So he said, we needed a negative for the thing. And I went, you're on. And so originally I experimented with it on Battersea Power Station and it looked brilliant. We had the logo on Battersea Power Station. And then we planned to do Buckingham Palace. That's what we were going to do originally. We got hold of a PR guy called Damien from Slice, said, we're going to do this. Get as much press as you can on this thing. We'll only have maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes at most. And so I remember we drove down towards Buckingham Palace, basically sounding like a tank because the projector needed a generator. The generator needed to be on, and we're in the back of a white van. And in that white van, there was me, the driver, and a guy called Mark Riddell, who was the MD. And James was waiting at home with all the lawyers. He was staying up all night. And that was it. And so we arrived at Buckingham Palace, and then to our horror, there were police jumping out from everywhere, behind trees, behind fences, everywhere. We were suddenly surrounded by the police, and the driver got handcuffed. I was getting handcuffed, and just as I was getting handcuffed, suddenly there's this huge light appeared. It was the press, and Damon did such a brilliant job. He had CNN, he had Sky, he had BBC, he had The Telegraph, he had The Observer. Literally, they're all taking pictures of us being arrested. And so I said to the policeman, I said, what are you arresting me for? Because you've got the world press here. And he took the handcuffs off me. And then he pulled out his book and he said, well, we're going to charge the driver with driving a heavy goods vehicle in a royal park. So that's what got busted for. And I went over to Damien and I said, literally off the cuff, I said, Damien, if you can get everybody to the Houses of Parliament, we can probably do that. We'll have 10 minutes or something, but just get them all over there and we'll do it there, because I don't think there'll be any police coming out the river. So he got everybody there. We went out, we beamed it on the Houses of Parliament. The pictures were taken, and that's how it evolved. And then my dad got woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning by somebody from his front desk, where they went, he goes, what? He goes, your troublesome son's up to it. And he went, what do you mean? And he said, he's just projected on the Houses of Parliament this logo. And when my dad found out what it was, he, bless him, he went, Well, that sounds like a fantastic story. It says, oh, the press. And he got up, went to, to the newspapers, put his best music journalists onto it. And then the whole thing exploded, and we later found out that the only newspaper it wasn't in was The Sun. And The Sun thought it was a great idea, but it didn't want, they couldn't send a journalist there. So they didn't want anybody else getting the story. So they tipped the police off. It was a crazy idea, but there was basically four of us. Damien on the ground, me, Mark, and the driver. Projectors in a tank.
In a tank, yeah.
heading towards Buckingham Palace.
Although it has been done since, I believe this was the first time a projection was done on the Houses of Parliament, or indeed any major building.
It was the first time it was done on a building like that. And the album was, it was the first of its kind. There hadn't been an official mix album that was actually mixed by a DJ that, came out for sale.
And I believe it became it's
the most successful dance compilation label in the history of music.
Ever. Number 88.
I'm learning a lot about this stuff now, to be frank, because and at the time you never really think about it. I just thought it was a great crack, to be honest with you. I really like James Palumbo. I have to say, he was one of my favourite people that I ever worked for. People used to say he's really difficult, but you'd sit down with James, have a 10-minute conversation. That's what it is. Great. And then you know where you stand. And I have to say, he didn't need to stay up all night, with contact to lawyers at all. He was there to pull us out of jail in case something happened. And I've got to give him credit for that.
And credit where credit's due, as I know the music industry isn't known for its morals. Is there anything you've done or said that you think, well, this isn't quite right, or where you think you should have been more transparent?
Oh God, I think that the one thing you can't accuse me of being, I'm completely transparent. I just mouth off. As you can see today, that's the way that I am. I call it how I see it. It's not for everybody. It's not necessarily great for corporations. People do get upset with me sometimes, but if I believe in something, then I'll fight for it. And I think too many people there's a real craft in being corporate. And people have always made a mistake with me. I really respect people that can play the game in a corporation. That's a gift. That's a craft. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And if you can do good from a position of power, well, good on you. But it just doesn't resonate with me because I can't keep my mouth shut. It's just as simple as that.
I wanted to follow up on a Channel 4 news item where you have been talking about a certain situation where you have had to defend an artist who refused the advances of a so-called important executive. What happened with this situation? And I'm presuming you can't name names.
As you can see, I've signed a lot of female artists. I think if you talk to any of them, they'll all tell you that I'm a very honourable person. I work with them on trying to get their level of professionalism seen. The industry and the way that I was brought up was more than sprinkled with perverts. It was just everywhere. Even when we used to leave school as kids, we used to, dodge the dirty mat brigade, as we call them. There were some very, very sexually abusive people in the world. Everybody kind of knew about, but never brought into public. Even at school, there was like sexually abusive priests. If you look at the history of St. Benedict's, So I have a real problem with it. I always have done. And I hate the idea of somebody being forced into doing something by a person in a position of power. So this is it's always been a problem for me, and I've always been quite protective of people. The Channel 4 thing, they didn't really want me to go into detail, but there's so many things that I'd seen that, And the thing that I was talking about, I'm not frightened to talk about, was actually to do with Annie. Because, we were having real problems, trying to get media to play their records. And their, radio promotion had managed to organise for Annie to be invited to the Radio 1 dinner, which is a huge thing. And of course, this could be a great opportunity because if she was well liked at that dinner, that would definitely bring her record to people's view and then they'll make a decision about it. So I talked to her and she said, yeah, absolutely. And I always remember she came to my office before she went to Radio 1 and she donned a black wig. She had this long black wig, basically dressed in leather and S&M gear. And I mean, I have to say, looked absolutely stunning. I mean, and off she went. And the following morning, I got a call about 7:30 in the morning, and it was the head of PR, the RCA PR, screaming at me, going, you and your fucking artists, they should be dropped, you should be fired, and I'm going, what's going on? We're calling a meeting because of what your artist's done. We're calling a corporate meeting, get into the office, you've got to be there by 9 o'clock. Everybody's going to be, you should be fired. She's a disgrace. And then there's all of this sort of stuff. So, so I rang Eddie up and I said, what happened? And she went, well, not really, but, she said that, this Radio 1 producer put his hand up my skirt, so I slapped him and knocked him off a chair and left. So she was very deadpan about it. She was not having any. And I went, well, good on you. So I went to RCA. When you watch Sweet Dreams, there's a conference room that is actually the conference room that I went to. So off I go, and I mean every single head of department is sitting there, and the vitriol attack on me, and particularly Annie, saying that she's a disgrace and blah blah blah. And I was in my mid-20s. I was quite young, so I was thinking. Anyhow, I was sitting there, and it wasn't really feeling comfortable for me what they were saying. They were saying that we should drop the Eurythmics, we should drop Annie, I should lose my job, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sitting thinking, well, this guy's put his bloody hand up a dress. It's kind of like, I think the person who should be fired is not Annie, and then eventually they went, what have you got to say? And so I remember standing up and I thought, well, here's another opportunity for me to lose my job. And so, and I said, look, I mean, I might be a bit mad, a bit crazy, but we have a female artist that is signed to the label that is being sexually molested by somebody from Radio 1. Right now, in my view, surely we should be protecting our female artists against this kind of abuse. And the whole place went quiet. And I was ready for the eruption. And again, Don Ellis, bless him, he stood up and he said, enough. He said, what Jack says is right. We protect our artists. And that's the end of it. And he closed the meeting. The reason why all this abuse goes on, and it still does, I mean, I think that the difficulty that corporations or companies that need to make money are relying on certain powerful media areas. And the trouble is you don't want to rock the boat because you need them. And unfortunately, they overlook things that, you take somebody like Jimmy Savile, everybody knew what was going on. I mean, absolutely everybody. And nobody would want to say anything because of the power of the media, because if they criticized him, he was in a position to not play records. If you're a record company and none of your records are being played, you're never going to have any hits. So people who are very, very kind of frightened and overlook this sort of stuff. And it's only when people die that people have the opportunity to come and say things. So, I mean, he was a disgrace. And he used to tour around England doing the road show in a caravan, abusing young kids. Jim will fix it. I mean, we all know about, but the reality is that's what went on. And I still to this day find it difficult why people, don't say anything. I can understand it, but surely your morals are more important than money. Or maybe not.
And do you think the culture of the music industry has changed and has it kept up with the times or at least tried to?
I think not completely, but more so. I think that the Me Too movement has created a lot more awareness. I mean, I would say that the only thing to be a little bit careful about is, trial by social media. Because, if somebody is unscrupulous and makes something up about somebody and you're tried in social media, you can be cancelled for actually not doing anything.
And I also gather your life has not always been like a bed of financial roses. I mean, it might appear that you've, jumped from one well-paid job to another, but this has not always been the case?
Well, it's life. You go through ups and downs. I could have been a lot better off if I, kowtowed to executives, really, at record labels. But the trouble for me is that I've always loved being on the front line and part of the creative process. I absolutely loathe snobbery and bullshit, which seem to be the components of modern business now. What I love is free and original thinking and the curiosity of going out of the norm. I mean, there were, I'm not going to mention any names, but I mean, I was often asked to, sort of, in one instance, for example, at a label, I was suggested that I start a publishing company with somebody within the label, and what the idea was that whatever artist I would sign would go to the label that was controlled by us. Of course, I would have made a fortune out of that. But I always felt that, if you start thinking about money first, then you miss out on the great creative opportunities. When I was working on Exile on Main Street, I mean, I know as I was young, I wasn't thinking about the money. It was the buzz. I mean, when I did the acid house parties, it was about the buzz. When I did the ministry, it was about the buzz. It was about, doing something that was original and different. But, if I was more focused on making money, if that was my priority, then I would have a completely different career. But not to say that. I mean, I do have respect for people that, move along the corporate ladder. That is a skill, and there's people that I know that have done unbelievably well. But for me, it's about creative achievement and not the money. I mean, that's always been the case. And yeah, as a result of that, I've been broke a few times.
Now, you've owned, co-owned and advised on a number of companies, including Memento, Fortress, Cuba Entertainment and 357. Tell me about these companies and what you wanted to and have achieved with them, especially in relation to the new world of downloads and how this has affected the A&R and management side of things.
These companies were great ideas. The truth is, I was never really able to sort of finish the job on those. I mean, I still have them kind of up there. But it just went through a difficult period where, my dad died, my mum developed multiple sclerosis. I had to look after her, which was not easy at all. It took up a lot of time. And I don't want any kind of pity. I mean, I don't want to be pitied about it, but it's just what it was. And then I developed cancer right in the middle of it all, stage 4 cancer. So these companies, unfortunately, in my opinion, weren't concluded. I think the ideas were great, but, I didn't have the physical well-being to put the energy to complete these companies. Some of them are still going on. I mean, as you can imagine, there were lots of interesting things. But this period really was where I dealt with a lot of health issues.
And overall, looking at what has been a long career, you've worked across all formats from vinyl to CDs to downloads. And we are now seeing what you might call a sort of like a democratization of music, with everyone being able to make music from their bedroom and release it to the world. Is music still controlled by big companies, or is it by social media? And how do you see the future of music?
Look, I love technologies and new technologies, but, and yes, I mean, you've got recording studios on laptops now. I mean, so there's a huge difference from when I started in the business. But, the one truism is that even though it's easy to produce, make and distribute music through social media, there's only a very small window for an artist to get through to become truly successful. So a lot of it gets thrown onto the wayside. To gain that kind of success does need a lot of funding, and you can't get away from that fact, be it, touring or writing or produce, whatever it is. Only a few will make it through. But in terms of, sort of creativity for yourself, it's wonderful. I mean, you could basically do an album on your laptop, as long as you know how to do it. If you record a guitar, for example, onto your laptop studio, you've got to know how it sounds and you've got to be able to really play it. And then you've got to incorporate into the kind of grooves and songs and ideas that you're trying to do. So that is quite complicated, and it's difficult for somebody in their bedroom to do that. It's easier in dance music, oddly. In dance music, you can make bedroom dance tracks because you can create beats. But, I love the greater accessibility to make music. I think that is wonderful. But, a lot of it's been a con. I mean, I've seen it, I've seen the business change a lot. I've seen it go from mono to stereo and radio, for example, from vinyl to CD, from Napster to streaming. And I've seen the, industry go kind of crazy about certain things. But the real golden age of music was analog recordings and vinyl albums. And that sound has never been surpassed. It's actually proven by the increase of, the demand on vinyl albums now. I mean, people are collecting them more than anything else. Though digital evolvement is, helped, it hasn't really overtaken the intimacy and the warmth of analog and vinyl. When you listen to that, you're with that piece of music. Whereas, sort of the digital sounds are a little bit more cold, and they don't wrap the room round like a, analog stereo album recording. I mean, the sad thing about it is that the CD revolution was an industry scam. I mean, the simple fact is that there was a lot of bullshit. The industry at the time went, oh, this is digital recording, blah, 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 this is better, blah, 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 which is rubbish. They said that the CDs are indestructible. And I remember having a CD representative come in my office and say that. And I slammed the CD on the corner of my table, put it into, and it didn't work. So that wasn't true. And the simple fact is that when CDs came through, they retailed them at £15 and they actually only cost about 30p to manufacture. So they were cheaper to manufacture than vinyl. When Napster came, I mean, everybody's going, oh, this is, I wasn't surprised with Napster. I mean, if you go back to the traditions of listening to music, I mean, when I bought Dark Side of the Moon, I rang up my mates and I said, look, I got an album, let's get together. And one of them would get a bag of weed, the other one would get some booze, and the other one would go, oh, look, mine's the best stereo, let's come out. And then we'd invite a few girls. I mean, that's how we listen to albums. So that kind of album sharing with Napster, I mean, it was on a much bigger scale, but again, that's the kind of natural way of listening to music. So I never had an issue with that. I always felt that the record industry were kind of like, the sort of prohibition of the old days. I mean, it's and it's it's like cannabis today. I mean, I tell you, you've got this great, huge music industry, and the one person I absolutely adore is Snoop Dogg, because if you look at his businesses, he had more perception about what the record industry really was than the corporations.
In what sense?
Well, in the sense of, he understands the value of his music. He understood the prohibited nature of cannabis, for example. If you look at where he came from and how he was ostracized by the business, and then he came up and was basically at the Olympics, commentating for the United States of America, Snoop Dogg. I mean, how cool is that?
And so finally, I was going to say, tell me some of the ridiculous things that have happened, and I think we've heard a fair few, where you think, my God, did that actually happen?
Again, I think you've got the idea of, the sort of curiosity I have. Even to this day, my thoughts are very much about the sort of, the purity of the craft, really. And I found myself in Atlanta at, sort of doing some recordings and stuff. And I was actually in Bobby Brown's studio. I mentioned that before. And I thought, well, what a great place for me to go and be curious about hip hop. I located some clubs and stuff. And I remember there was a girl at the studio called Dawn, who was quite a pretty girl. So she sort of said she'd take me down to a few clubs. And I remember Bobby Brown's dad, actually. He heard about it and he came in and he said, we hear you're going to some hip hop clubs. And I went, yeah, that's the idea. I just want to get a feel for it. And he said, well, let me organize somebody to help you. And he organized me this bodyguard. And he said, you shouldn't go like, they made a thing that I shouldn't go alone. And so off we went. And it was so different from what I was used to in the UK and Europe. The cultural thing was unbelievable. I mean, it was like this one huge party. I mean, I remember going to one club called the Oxygen Club, and it was kind of, you had a 2 rooms in it. You had one which is purely DJ, and then you had the other side which was, like with a live band. And then people can come up and, what they used to call spitting. They used to go up and do their raps and stuff like that. And I remember at the time there was a song where the chorus of it was, everybody from New York sing, yeah. They'll go, yeah. Everybody from Los Angeles sing, yeah. Go, yeah. And I shouted out, what about London? And then the band literally just sort of was playing, and they looked at me and they went straight into Play That Funky Music, White Boy, which was absolutely hysterical. So anyhow, Dawn then sort of suggested that I go and see, a real deep hip hop club in West Atlanta, and I had no idea. And I know my driver was a bit nervous about it. And I remember going into that club, and I remember the doorman saying, if there's any trouble, I ain't going in. And you could see that they were armed. And I went into that club, and I initially there were no issues at all. And they kind of knew that I was a bit odd. They didn't, and there was no problem with the girls, but the guys really took offense to me. I think they thought I was an Atlanta potato farmer or something. I don't know what they did. And so I got cornered in that club, and one of them pulled a gun at me. And it was only my English accent. I turned around and I said, good God, what a strange place, what a strange position to be in, I think I said, or something stupid, And they were so surprised by my accent that they dropped their guns, and Tony pulled me out and threw me out the exit door. And when we left, he actually said, at that time, he said, it was your English accent that stopped you from being shot. Now, I had no idea. I guess I didn't have I guess being from England, you never kind of realised, the barrier between black culture of that time and white culture. I mean, it never kind of dawned on me that there was, I don't feel that. I mean, we didn't really have that in the UK. And I remember the following morning, I was friends with Speech and Headliner from Arrested Development. And they rang me up and they went, I can't remember what it was. It was the 511 Club or something. I said, you went to the 511 Club? And I went, yeah. And they went, are you fucking crazy? I said, why? I said, we're black and we wouldn't go to the 511 Club. I mean, it was literally like that. And then after that, I remember, I had a mentor called Bud Prager, who's Foreigners manager, and he heard about it. And he took me through the ringer. I mean, he absolutely bollocked me. He said, are you fucking crazy? Why are you going into these clubs? And I said, well, first of all, I'm interested about, and he says, do you not care about your family? And I went, hold on a sec. First of all, I got great curiosity about this music, and I want to see in reality what it is. I don't want to, sort of be, I want to be in it. So he said, but, you're lucky you didn't get shot. And I went, and he says, and you just shouldn't do that. And I said, I'm beginning to realize this kind of, this barrier between black and white, I said to him. But, if people don't try and break those barriers and do what I do, you're always going to have that. And you're all going to live in fear. And I remember him going very quiet about that.
There we have it. A slice of the life and times of Jack Stephen. There's plenty more to tell, but Jack's teeth need their beauty sleep. Just to say, thank you, Jack. Jack Stephen and David Bowie's Teeth was produced, written, edited and presented by me, Douglas Pye, executive producer, Paul Cook. It was recorded at Guilt Free Studios, and the music was by Cure for Paranoia. This was a Cook Pie production.
Psalm 34 and 4, I sought the Lord, deliver me from all my fears. It's funny how I prayed to evade my enemies, and he delivered me from all my peers. But y'all don't hear me though. Wish I had somebody in the building that was trying to have church right now, cause I got a word right now, learn right now that it ain't the situation that's hectic, it's just a perspective. And the image you project on it is just a reflection. Stop blocking your blessings, stop talking if you talking about stressing. I bind the enemy and spirits bringing fear and depression. I wish you peace and light.
I've got another little story if you want another little story.